So hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome to MAXDAYS. I'm very excited to be here for a second time in my academic career. So the first time I was at MAXDAYS, I presented on my master's thesis, and now I am presenting on my PhD thesis, which are entirely different topics. But today I will talk to you about what I've been researching for the last 3.5 years. So you can see what the state of a dissertation looks like towards the end and what kind of tools I've been working with in MaxQDA throughout this entire stretch. As Tamara said, I'm presenting on my dissertation, which focuses on turning Rustbelts into microchip valleys, innovation policy for regional revitalization. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit before I get into my project about the field that I'm coming from. I'm from Science Technology Studies, so I'm at the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at the Technical University of Munich. And what we look at is science and technology from a different point of view. So instead of looking at it from a natural science point of view or studying just the impacts of technology or users of technology, we really look at the cultural, the social, the legal, and the ethical dimensions of science and technology and how those fit into society. So we are a social science, and we try to tackle problems, opportunities of science and technology through a social lens. So when I started my PhD, it was kind of pitched to me as a study of lost regions of innovation. What does that mean? I've taken it to mean Rust Belt regions. So these are places that are suffering from very classic post-industrial problems, such as depopulation, shrinkage, brain drain, economic downfall, and having a reputation of being left behind. And just to explain this a little bit more, this happened all across the globe, but especially in the United States in the 70s and 80s, there was this huge push for globalization where heavily industrial regions were completely decimated by sending jobs overseas. A lot of these jobs went to places like China and Southeast Asia because labor there was so much cheaper, and manufacturing there was so much more economic for people in the United States. But what happened is places in the Midwest mostly lost entire community practice. So entire regions were completely emptied out from the jobs that people used to depend on. And that created what are now called Rust Belt regions, so places that have kind of fallen behind and don't have this single industry to carry them through. And then with brain drain, what I mean by that is people leaving those communities to go elsewhere to get college degrees and to try to be part of the knowledge economy in the United States. So try to get more high-tech jobs and less industrial manufacturing. So those are the regions that I'm looking at. I'm thinking about what makes a place innovative and what makes a place fall behind the reputation of being innovative. Policymakers have this challenge of what to do with these types of places. So they look at these regions that have been left behind by globalization and by people leaving them, and they try to think of ways to bring them into the future and to give them futures. And one of those ways is innovation policy. So thinking about a place that is extremely left behind and doesn't have innovation. I see a raised hand here. I hope that there are no issues, but if you for some reason cannot hear me, maybe just put it in the chat and I will just take that as a question for the future. But okay, so back to my work. So innovation policy is this idea that you can bring innovation to a place that doesn't have a lot through, for example, high-tech manufacturing, or bringing something like Silicon Valley to a certain place. Okay, sorry, I'm seeing that there are several raised hands. I hope that there are no issues.
We can all hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay,
and if someone has any questions, please do not raise your hand, but please post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Tamara. Sorry, everyone. I just got really distracted by that and thought that maybe there were issues. Okay, so I'll keep going and I'll ignore the raised hands for now. So the idea of innovation policy is that you can bring this thing that happened also in the 70s and 80s and was quite successful, and that thing is Silicon Valley. So probably everyone here has heard of Silicon Valley at one point or the other, and maybe doesn't have an exact idea of what the Silicon Valley model is, but has an imagination of what Silicon Valley means. And what Silicon Valley is actually is a place in California where several things were invented. For example, semiconductors, for example, the internet, the computers we use today, the Apple devices that I'm using right now. But the idea behind it is that you can combine public and private funding to create economic success. So you can take universities and use the research done at universities with private companies, and from there you create more innovation, and that will benefit the wider public. So one of the innovation policies that policymakers have been thinking about is taking the ideas behind Silicon Valley and trying to replicate them elsewhere, especially in places that have been left behind. So I'm just going to say a tiny bit about the theory that I'm using and my concepts. I work with the deficit model of innovation, so similar to the like public information deficit, the idea that because people don't have enough knowledge, that is why they reject certain things. The deficit model of innovation says that there's this innovation imperative. Places need to be more innovative to have desirable futures. And the reason that they struggle is because they do not have enough innovation. Therefore, more innovation will fix places. And this is very much in line with the idea of bringing Silicon Valley to the Rust Belt. So, part two. So I've already said a bunch about innovation policy to revitalize Rust Belt regions. The only thing I want to say here is that this is not necessarily an American phenomenon, although it really sounds like one. The Smartest Places on Earth talks about Rust Belts all over the world, including in the Netherlands, including in Germany, and how they are becoming hotspots of global innovation. The other thing I want to say that's very important for my research is there's one very specific example of innovation policy that is attempting to revitalize Rust Belt regions in the United States right now, called the US Chips and Science Act. So what the US Chips and Science Act, and this is quite central to my research, so I'll explain it a little bit. What it does is it promises billions, 54 billion to be exact, in funding to bring chips manufacturing back to US soil for both national and economic security. For national and economic security, this basically, in a very, very simplified way, means that the US used to have a much larger manufacturing capacity of chips, but that was all sent away to Asia in the 80s, including in this globalization trend. And what they're trying to do now is bring some of this capacity back to US soil to keep certain adversaries from accessing it. And those adversaries are China, for example. Our highest level of research and development is currently in Taiwan, and Taiwan has a lot of political tension with China. So currently this is a goal of the United States to have some of this capacity back in the US. Within this act, so by bringing all of this technology, not only R&D, but also manufacturing, the US promises to train workforce, which will provide jobs for people, and in the end, rebrand economically struggling places. So instead of being known as a place that used to do manufacturing, for example, Ford, now they will do manufacturing, for example, for a semiconductor company. And President Joe Biden said at a fab groundbreaking in Ohio, so when they were building a fabrication facility in central Ohio, it's time to bury the Rust Belt and call it the Silicon Heartland. So finally, to my research questions, what kind of questions am I asking in my research? What I'm really interested in is which institutions, policies, or regions are seen as role models, and how are they transferred to Rust Belt regions? And I've already answered this a bit. Obviously, Silicon Valley is seen as kind of like the prime example of what a region should look like and how it should be successful. And I'm really interested in what does the transfer of this look like? Second, how do these regions that are kind of given this idea to become like Silicon Valley, how do they actually deal with the innovation imperative and the policy strategies that are enacted upon them? Third, how do policymakers justify this reindustrialization of places at both the regional and national level? And then how do regions react to that justification? And finally, what type of future does innovation policy promise to Rust Belt regions? And then alternatively, what kind of future are they imagining for themselves? And are these the same? So I've already explained what STS does. My group looks specifically at public policies. That's why I'm looking at this from a public policy perspective. So I don't need to say too much about that. But I do want to say a little bit about socio-technical imaginaries. So within my research, I'm using this concept of socio-technical imaginaries to understand how society and technology are brought together in an imagination of the future. So the term comes from Sheila Jasanoff, and I'll read you the definition. Socio-technical imaginaries describe deterministic future visions of social and technological order and illustrate how the implementation of innovation models in different cultural contexts are co-produced with locally specific social deficits and acceptable solutions. So basically, in very, very simplified words, I'm looking at policy narratives versus local visions. My methodology is a qualitative multi-case study. So I've taken 3 different cases, upstate New York, which includes 2 cities, Central Ohio, which also includes 2 cities, and then a bigger region, the bigger region of Flanders, which not as simple as a state in the United States, but kind of covers a bigger area, and I take 1 city as my case in that area. The reason I've taken these 3 cases is because they all have CHIPS-related institutions or initiatives. In upstate New York and Central Ohio, these are very much within the US CHIPS and Science Act. And in Flanders, this is from basically 1984 onwards, an institution that has kind of determined the innovation culture in the region and is taken as a role model for places like upstate New York and Central Ohio for what they would like to become, as well as Silicon Valley. So just to give you an idea of the region I'm looking at, and maybe to say a bit about myself, I'm actually from upstate New York. When I was growing up there, I did not see this as an innovative region, and you'll learn a little bit more about that, but this is kind of what it looks like. It's very rural. It's one of the most poverty-stricken areas of the state, and it doesn't really fit into this high-tech imaginary of a future. And then within my cases, I've done over 60 interviews at this point. It's a bit more with various stakeholders. I've looked at 40 White House press releases and other national and regional news media sources. And I've done several site visits to all of these places, to universities within these places, and to semiconductor institutions in these places. And finally, I've been to several conferences and events that have something to do with semiconductors, whether that's industry or from a public perspective. I try to attend as many as possible. Okay, so I'm going to bring you to the real part of this, which is how I use MaxQDA in my research and to analyze my data. So the first thing is quite obvious. I use it to code my interviews. This is the document portrait. I'm going to say a little bit about that. But first, I'll just tell you generally what I do. So within my interviews, I have a set of codes for each case study. So I said before, I have 3 different case studies. And within each of those, I have a set of codes. Some codes go between the sets. So when I'm talking about much bigger ideas, then that might be relevant to all of them. But a lot of them are pretty fixed for the area and are regionally specific. I've tried to have parent codes with about 10 subcodes. And my parent codes will represent major themes of my research, like prosperity or innovation or models, something to do with the semiconductor industry or futures. And then within those, I'll have 10 different subcodes. And I'm mostly doing inductive coding with occasional in vivo. That means that I'm taking interview quotes and kind of drawing out broader ideas. And then in vivo means that I take the actual quote of what someone says and make that into a code. Sometimes a quote is so strong that it acts as its own code. And then, yeah, here I'll talk about the document portrait. Interviews will typically span many codes, but there will usually be some main takeaways and messages. And as you can see in this document portrait, you can definitely see that the predominant color is black. And this represents one of my parent codes, which is always in all capitals, lost. And then within it, several subcodes. And you can see our conversation kind of goes between different themes, but some of them keep coming back. For example, this idea of being a lost region keeps coming back again and again. The idea of jobs is the second most used one. That one also keeps coming up again and again. And you can see that some of them come up in connection with each other. Okay, so I'm going to bring you to some of my findings. First, what I noticed really immediately is that there are very key differences in the discourse among the interviewees, who tend to be at the more local and regional level, people who live in the region, and policymakers who stand at the more national level. So they're coming in from the top down, and they don't necessarily live in the region. And I'm going to show you two of the tools from MaxQDA that I used to see how these priorities are almost inverse between the two groups. So starting with the code cloud in upstate New York, what I've done is I've taken my codes from the interviews, and I've used those codes to kind of show here what is most prioritized, so what was most talked about. And as you can see in the document portrait, lost is really sticking out here. And I'll talk more about those in a minute, but just to give you a visual. And then I took 41 White House press releases, and because these press releases were all only focused on chips, I could do a word cloud here. So before, the interviews cover a lot of ground, so I did a code cloud, and here I did a word cloud. So you can see that very different words between the two are standing out, and very different themes are coming to light. So I'll just spell that out here so you have an idea. In the interviews in the upstate New York region, so this is what I'm showing now, people focus much more on the idea of the region being lost, the idea that there's nothing for you here, that there's a lack of jobs, and that they need revitalization. So they're much less likely to speak extensively on the semiconductor industry or development. They didn't really talk too much about technology or semiconductor research and development, whereas the press releases focus much more on chips, manufacturing, research and development, jobs, semiconductors, and really not too much on regional revitalization or communities. So my second set of findings, what I found really telling from my interviews is that there's this very specific identity within the Rust Belt, that people are from a place that is left behind. And this really comes from the diagnosis of having a deficit in innovation. So the identity of a Rust Belt person and their post-industrial struggles are really co-produced with the idea that innovation and economic theories and related policy imperatives will solve their problems. And then this basically says the same thing. The idea that a Rust Belt is futureless is so strong only because it's co-constructed next to this bright and glitzy innovation economy that is related to Silicon Valley. And then the way that innovation and this policy, this top-down thing is understood by people in Rust Belt regions shows us that they have deeper negotiations about value and identity, which are rooted in industrial decline. So I've taken the lost parent code that I've talked about already, and I analyzed the sentiment, and I found it really interesting, and it really helped validate this finding, but then also show me something new. Most of the relations to the idea of the region being lost were negative or slightly negative. And then I just put kind of a cheat of how to do this at the bottom. And I wanted to check that out, and I really wanted to learn more about it. So I used this AI assist chat, which is something I've just started working with this year in MaxQDA and found to be really, really useful, especially because it points out specifically where in the interviews you can find these quotes, and it really summarizes it for me. So it's hard to read through hundreds of codes, but it is much easier to have this nice little paragraph. And what I found here is that there is this very negative sentiment about the state of the region rather than the positive one. And then the AI assist gave me a lot of very specific places to look. So bringing you to my third findings, because I need to tie this up pretty soon. Actors are very aware that it is uncertain whether or not this idea to bring chips to the region is actually going to solve their problems. So while the people in upstate New York have been told that investing in a future there is going to solve them, they haven't really seen a lot of these problems being solved, and they're becoming more skeptical. They're feeling more left behind than before. Again, I use the AI assist tool to try to have a conversation with my data, and this is one of my new favorite things to do, is instead of, or after reading through and coding, instead of coding again, I then like to converse with my data as if I were conversing with the person. And so what I've done here is ask, how does this person seem to feel about the industry in upstate New York? What should policymakers be doing instead, according to her? And the AI assist had some really interesting answers, and it also pointed me to some very specific parts of my data that I could look to. And I just wanted to bring that out. But it gave me a really nice and solid summary of my interview. So I'm going to draw some conclusions and bring this to an end. Very simply put, policymakers and the people that I interviewed in the upstate New York region and throughout my entire project just don't see eye to eye on the correct way to move forward for Rust Belt regions. There's this idea to build a microchip innovation hub to revitalize places, and it's not really being taken up by locals in upstate New York, which kind of tells me that it's not going to be taken up in other places either. What MaxQDA has helped me do is really highlight differences in priorities and foci within discourse across multiple data sources. So it really simplifies a quite complex series of data points and helps me see some clear messages. So I wanted to end this presentation before I take questions on some of my reflections and the lessons that I've learned in doing a dissertation and working on a project for over 3 years and in collecting all sorts of data. The first thing is that every time I go back into MaxQDA and I kind of dive back into my data and I start looking at it when I'm writing a paper, when I'm trying to pull quotes, I see new patterns and new codes. So my best advice to people who are just starting to work with MaxQDA or just starting their PhDs, or even people who are very deep in it, keep your data updated, upload all the data, not just the interviews. So I started with just doing my interviews and now I've put everything, including policy documents, photographs, news articles, literature. And it really helps me to see these patterns emerge across data and not just within one data site. And code frequently and reflexively. So the more you code, the more you see, the more you think, the more you can reflect on the patterns that you're finding. And then some points for myself. I think there's so much more to learn about the new features of MaxQDA. And I think although I've been using it for many years, although I love it and I tell everyone else to use it, I still feel like I'm new somehow to this service and there's still more for me to learn. And I only do qualitative research, and MaxQDA is for qualitative research, but there are quantitative tools available that I think could also be really, really useful in trying to translate some of my qualitative findings into, for example, more economic terms to present to other audiences. And I think I'm missing them, but I know that they're there. So I'm going to bring this to an end and open it up for Q&A for the last few minutes. But thank you for being here. I appreciate everyone who took the time to watch this and to attend the conference, and I hope you learn a lot. So.
Thank you very much, Marlies. I think there are no questions yet at the Q&A section, but they might be coming in soon. But while we are waiting, I really enjoyed the part of your presentation when you were talking about how you are chatting with your data. And maybe you could tell us more about what type of questions you are asking and what are your considerations behind using these questions.
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's saved me, I have to say, a lot of time. So I recently did it with a set of interviews that I didn't feel like I had adequate time to code. And then I went back and I did it with interviews that I've already extensively coded, just kind of as an experiment. And I did this in 2 different ways. So the first way that I did this when I was looking at interviews that I hadn't yet had time to code, but I wanted to kind of understand more, is I asked the AI assist to give me a summary of the interview, a 1-paragraph summary, and I got a lot of really easy bullet points where I didn't have to read through all of it, but I could just read the summary. And then based on that summary, I asked questions like, how did this person imagine a future for the region? How is this imagination different from, per se, Silicon Valley? What kinds of visions does this person have about science and technology? So just these really simple questions. And I often find what's really interesting about AI Assist is that, maybe not interesting, it's just really well done. When I go through interviews that I've already coded and I ask those same types of questions, I see that it very much aligns with things that I've picked out myself. So they show me segments, when they have those numbers next to each other, it's like this line, this line, this line that I've already coded. And it's just a really nice way for me not to replace the coding process, but to give myself either validation of what I've already coded or a very easy and quick way to summarize the data that I'm looking at without having to spend hours and hours going through and coding, which I do at some point anyway. But when I'm trying to quickly find something, it's also nice to say, point me in the direction of this specific imagination of this specific interviewee.
Thank you. That is certainly very excited to see how coding and asking questions also can come in hand in hand, and how that can also inspire your coding process. I can see some questions already in the Q&A, and I think we also have 2 questions in the chat.
Yeah, I only see the ones in the chat actually.
So I would read you the ones in the Q&A.
Okay,
so the first questions that we have there is, how do you mention that you use AI assist in your thesis?
That's a great question. I am writing up my thesis now, and I'm thinking about the methods section. And I think I will just write that I use the tools of MAXQDA, and I will write what those include. Since I don't use AI assist to draw any major conclusions, and since I think of it as more of a validation of the work that I've already done, I probably won't cite that I use AI as an additional method, but I will include it as a tool of MAXQDA that is useful in analyzing and coding my data. I see 2 questions in the chat. So one of them is, what is the total number of interviewees? I mentioned that it's around 60, and that is across all of my cases. So I have about 20 interviews in each case. And what I didn't mention is how long these interviews are. Some of them are up to 2 hours long. Most of them are around 1 hour. And some interview partners I've interviewed multiple times over the course of 3 years. I also see, how would you describe the role of AI? I think that's kind of like the one I just answered. It's very similar, but it's in my analytic process. Since I had access to this program so late in my process, I think that it's become more of a double check than it has been like a sparring partner or colleague or assistant. I see it more as being like, if I were to ask a student assistant to go through my data and double check that this person had this kind of feeling, or to summarize an interview, which is what I did when I was a student assistant, I see it very similarly to that. So less like a colleague and more like an assistant, or just something to do make a long task shorter. But I see it as a very useful component. Here's another one that just came in. Do I use AI to pull a quick summary of documents? And if so, what conversations do you have or ask of this type of data? I have not yet used AI on anything but my interviews, to be honest. I think the documents that I look at, the press releases tend to be maximum 3 pages. If that, mostly they're speeches. So I find them pretty easy to engage with, as opposed to a 2-hour interview that can sometimes go down several different rabbit holes that have nothing to do with my research. And so I can't really say much about that, but I would be curious if other people use it, what they find with looking at documents versus looking at interviews, because I think that, interviews are, for me, much harder to summarize, but that's because of the length of policy documents that I'm looking at. I'm not looking at bills, I'm looking at speeches, because I'm looking at discourse. But people who are actually doing legal work, this might be very useful in looking at 300-page documents and not having to actually read through them.
Thank you. There is also one question further up in the chat that is asking you about the number of interviews that you have coded and that you have in your project. And then there is also another question in the Q&A section that talks to you about that is asking you about what tools do you find the most helpful in your research within MaxQDA, and if you could talk more about the benefits, challenges, and opportunities of AI assist. And then there is also another question about how accurate you find AI assist features regarding coding suggestions, sentiment analysis, etc.
Since I stopped sharing my screen, I have finally found the Q&A section. So now I can see it myself, but thank you for reading it aloud. The tools I found most helpful are the ones that I talked about. I'm a very visual person. And first of all, I found it really helpful to have a space where I could put all of my documents and have them in folders and then see all of my codes. And I love the function of having a parent code and then subcodes next to it. I just find the entire visual atmosphere of MaxQDA to be very conducive to the way that I work. So the word cloud, the code cloud, I find all of these visualizations very useful for just seeing which words are popping out. That to me is more intuitive than some of the other tools there, which is like the pattern tool where you can take all of your codes and kind of draw patterns. I never quite got into that. I also really like the sentiment analyzation. I find that really interesting, especially when you do these very emotional interviews where you can analyze the sentiment and see, how do people talk about this with what kind of language? And because I study discourse, the words that people are using are really important, and what connotations those words have also mean something. Benefits, challenges, and opportunities of AI assist. Lots of questions about AI assist today. So benefits, it has saved me a bit of time. Challenges, I think, is in line with another question, which is about accuracy. I'm pretty confident in how accurate it has been so far, but a challenge for me would be being fully dependent on the AI assist and really being able to trust everything that it's telling me. So if I ask for a summary of a document, for example, I would worry that it might miss something that I myself would find important. So I think the way that I use AI assist is very much like find me or like what are the general ideas that are coming out of this interview, as opposed to where does this person talk about the way they feel about innovation. That's something where I just feel like I would have to think about the way something was said, the emotion with which it was said, the conversation I had at the time, that I don't think AI assist could do that work. And then I haven't used the coding suggestions. I find the sentiment analysis. So in my presentation, you can see that it's, in terms of accuracy, it's interesting because when I go through that presentation and then you see one of the negative ones is, I do not think of this region as a lost region. That is not necessarily a negative connotation about the region itself. That's a negative connotation about the idea that it is lost. And that is a different meaning from somebody saying, this region is left behind. And that is something that AI does not pick up on yet, that I picked up on when I looked back at it. So there are instances in which I think, okay, this isn't where I would code it, but that's a really, really fine detail. And so I think that is really up to the researcher to decide, am I going to be fully dependent on this analysis, or am I going to take a second look at it and make the decision for myself? And I think we should always be the last person to make a decision about our data.
I think some of the mapping tools that you have mentioned might be also interesting. So for example, MaxMax, there you can build some models, and also that is a very useful tool to explore your data. I will post a link to that feature in the chat. That might be interesting for us.
I did just see, so somebody asked me the total number of interviews, and someone above that asked how many would suffice. It really depends what field you're in, and it really depends what you're researching. And it also depends when you feel you've gotten the information that you're looking for. So I think that that is not an easy question to answer. And that is, if you're doing a PhD, up to you and your supervisor and your dissertation committee. So for me, my research around 60 interviews has sufficed, but that's not the only data that I'm pulling from. I'm also pulling from my own observations, the discourse of speeches and press releases, news articles, blog posts, photographs that I've taken. There's a lot of different sources that I'm pulling from, and the interviews were more informational. They're super interesting and super useful, but they aren't the only thing that I'm depending on. So if your entire thesis is only dependent on interviews, that answer might be different.